Hello and welcome to a cornucopia of tales and tellers. I'm Simona, and here is Alan. Hello, Alan.
Good morning, everybody.
And today we are joined by the wonderful Elena Asciutti. Hi, Elena. How are you?
Good morning, Simone and Alan. I'm doing very well. And yourselves?
Pretty good,
Good,
pretty good.
thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me here.
Oh,
It's our
pleased you could give us the
pleasure.
time. Yeah, thank you very much.
And today we're going to talk with Elena about her passion for storytelling, and we're going to talk about Diffusione Fiaba. And Elena, of course, is going to tell us a story. So let's start with some questions, Elena, because Alan and I are really looking forward to speaking with you.
Mhm.
And we wanted to start with something very basic. So, why are you a storyteller? Where does your passion for storytelling come from? Why do you love stories?
Yes, thank you very much, Simona. It's basic, but it's not that evident, I think. It's a very good series of questions. So first of all, well, I started in a way 10 years ago, more or less, because there was a triggering event. I was in Catania, the city I come from in Sicily, and I went to see a free event celebrating the winter solstice. And in one of the artists of this celebration of this, it was a collective artistic performance. And one of the artists was a storyteller, a Sicilian storyteller who was telling one of the most known legends in Sicily, but also in the southern part of Italy. And then I found out that this legend is also known somewhere else than Italy. And the name of the legend is Cola Pesce, Nick the Fish. And I was really struck by his performance because that legend is very well known. So I knew even when I was a child, but the way he told that story really impressed me. And so after I went to see him and I said, how do you do that? And so he told me this storyteller whose name is Gaspare Balsamo, is quite well known in Sicily and I believe also in other regions of Italy. He told me a little bit his parcours. And then at that time I was living in Brussels and I looked for a storytelling school because I said, I really want to do what he did, of course, with a lot of modesty because he's a professional actor and storyteller. And so I started this training in Brussels, where there is a place called Le Théâtre de la Parole, so the word theater, the theater of word, and they do have storytelling courses. And there, yes, I found out that basically the passion for stories had always been with me, but maybe, life takes you to many different pathways. And maybe I had put this in a corner of my brain, heart, and gut. And then thanks to Gaspar and then to the storytelling course, I started, digging and find it back. And so I became so passionate and attached. And basically, I like them because, first of all, I've been learning a lot through stories, especially traditional stories, fairy tales or fiabe in Italiano. And I really like this connection that through stories, the storyteller and the listeners can establish. It's very magic. It's something that I never experience differently. I mean, it doesn't matter whether the storyteller and the audience, they know each other, but it's very immediate, very magic, and it goes through the use of the word that is, if we think about, is not science fiction, is an ability that most of us have. And then the third element is so I said learning, the empathy, the connection, but also traveling. I really like this feeling that I get when I hear and listen to, or myself, I look for new stories, that there is this possibility to travel in time and space. Yes, and to see beautiful landscapes and meet different people that otherwise we wouldn't have met. Voila.
I love that. There's
Wonderful.
always that thing when people say when they get into storytelling, there's always that one event or there's always that one person they will forever remember that maybe ignited or reignited a passion for and an interest in it, and sort of everybody remembers that. There's even literature here in Ireland of that going back generations by people
Mm,
being taken aback by storytellers and then that, defining them afterwards. There's actually a book I was reading not that long ago by Frank Delaney where it was a story from the 1940s,
mhm.
and it was a storyteller that just took a 9-year-old boy into a brand new, or different world that he was into. I just love that everybody has that sort of that one person to ignite the flame. It's really nice.
Yeah, yeah, and then I also find out while I was doing the storytelling course, a lot of memories start coming back. So I start recalling my grandmother, the mother of my father, when I was a child, used to tell me a specific Sicilian story by a character we called Jufa. And so it was incredible, again, a way to travel back in the past and to recall how my grandmother indeed was telling, without reading, of course, stories that had been passed to her by maybe her mother and back and back. So yes, indeed, it's an incredible way to stimulate the brain. And on this, I think there are a lot of scientific papers by neuroscientists that confirms what happens in a way in our brains when we listen or we tell stories.
Yeah. And it's wonderful to hear you talk, Elena, because well, we are both Italian,
Yeah.
but we like come from two different sides of Italy. I'm in the very north, and Sicily is in the southern part of
Mhm.
Italy. We have very different experiences because you told us about the fact that your grandmother told you stories orally, and in Sicily it's a tradition that keeps going, like storytelling
Mhm.
is alive. And here in the north is not like that so much. For example, with folk tales. So my grandparents never told me stories, never told me folk tales. And if I ask other people all around here where I live, this tradition is not alive.
Mm.
Um, and
Yeah.
it's good also that you told us about Juffa.
Yeah.
So for people who are not familiar with the name, because it's very specific to Italy, you may know Juffa as Joha or as Nasruddin. The stories are intertwined with this character who's got different names all over the Mediterranean area. But here in
Exactly.
the north, again, we don't have Juffa. We don't have Juffa stories. So every time I've got to try and find some Italian stories, I come across Juffa stories, but they're all from the south of Italy. So I'm
Exactly.
like, all right, if I have to tell a story from where I live, all right, it's an Italian story, but it's not from here. And they're great stories, absolutely wonderful stories.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's this kind of full young man, but at the same time with a tweak of wisdom. So every time I listen or I tell a Jufa story, indeed, I I think a lot. I mean, it makes listeners think about how lives can go and what different pathways life indeed can take. So it's very interesting characters.
Yeah, and there's this I think uh Italian is specific to Italian stories, to Jufa stories, that Jufa is very young
Mhm.
compared to Joha and Nasruddin.
Yes.
So it's like a young character compared to Joha and Nasruddin stories. So that's also very interesting. We could talk for a whole podcast
Yes.
about Jufa.
Yeah, Jufa, I think, might have deserved a series of PhD theses actually, because the more you know him and his stories, the more you get passionate. And again, it's interesting to make all this connection with the Middle East, where indeed is called Yochao Nasruddin and is a wise, let's say, adult man, but also in Napoli. There is a Jufa, which is called Verdatiello, who is also a young man, I think a teenager, because he's still living with the mama and still in needs of mama for whatever he needs. So very similar to Jufa. Yes, and it shows again the element of how traditional stories can be trans countries, right? I was in touch with several storytellers from the Mediterranean area, and indeed is an element that traditional, features or characters of oral telling that puts us connect us.
Does does Jufa have a time frame if he's a teenager or a young adult? So the Turkish or the Iranians will say Nasruddin has a sort of time frame of several hundred years ago, and they've sort of traced him back to a village or a town. In Italy, does Jufa have like is there research into a time frame of when such a character might have existed, or like the version in Napoli, if there's a time frame for that?
So the one in Naples comes from the fairy tale collection, The Tales of Tales, L'Ucuntu degli Cunti di Giambattista Basile, which was written and then released in the mid of the 17th century, so 1600. In Sicily, I don't really know the first time that he was released in a written text that goes back to the second half of the 19th century, so 1800s. But I mean, I assume that that is very old tradition indeed, that has come to Sicily, or from Sicily went somewhere else in the Mediterranean region, because as you know, this is a very important trade area, and so there have been a lot of exchange and communication in between Sicily and the Middle East. On the top in Sicily, we had 100 years ago 200 years of presence of Arabs. So I guess that's somehow we got that influence. Yeah.
Nice, thanks.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And Elena, you mentioned that you took a storytelling course in
Mhm.
Brussels.
Yes,
So I guess that was in French, so that
exactly.
you started telling stories in French. And how is your experience of telling in other languages and telling in Italian? How is it for you?
Yes, thank you. It's a very interesting question, even because I'm a big supporter of multilingualism. Indeed, it is not always easy, but as you said, in Brussels, I started telling stories in French, and most of them were Sicilian stories. So it was a good mix of where I come from and the language of the country that at that moment was hosting me. I really like to jungle in between languages. So sometimes, even when I tell in a language which is not mine, I try to use some Italians. It depends, of course, whether the story allows, whether it makes sense to mingle Italian to another language. But I mean, I feel as comfortable as in Italian when I tell in another language. I mainly tell in Italian, of course, in English, and less in French, I have to say. Yeah, I think it's very charming to have this capacity to switch in between languages. And for me, Brussels was very important in a way to let my teachers as well as my friends learning together with me Sicilian story, because it's not that evident. Most of the materials or fairy tales we were studying from would have come from important French collectors like Henri Gogo, who is a storyteller and collector of fairy tales in France, very well known. He has been working, I think, for over 60 years in this field, or more traditional, traditionally known collection like Grimm. So to have fairy tales in Brussels from collectors like Giuseppe Pitre and Laura Gosenbach, who did collect Sicilian stories in the 19th century. I was referring to them before when we were talking about Tuffa. For me, it was a kind of a question of pride and somehow make unknown stories known. And this is a little bit one of the let's say aims that I like to pursue when I tell stories, and when I take care of Diffusione Fiaba, which is the storytelling radio show that I started 4 years ago in community web radio in Firenze.
Right, and you stopped exactly where I wanted to go next. So Elena, we want to know everything about Diffusione Fiaba, your program, and how did you start? How is it working with a radio? And like, what is your main takeaway from speaking with all these different people, storytellers from all over the world on your show, on your program?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Simona. So I start from where the radio show is grounded, which is a radio, as I said, is a community web radio. And the name of the radio is Radio Cavolo. Now, for non-Italian speaker, if I do have to translate, it means a cabbage radio. So the Radio Cavolo is a community web radio, as I said, which is based in a university in Firenze. The university is called European University Institute, and actually is the place where I work in my professional life. So Radio Cavolo was an initiative of the students and researchers of these universities, because they felt the need to have a university radio. I mean, radio in universities are very common. So I think now around 6 years ago, students and researchers advocated the university management to establish a community radio, and they did. So the radio was ready to be launched at the beginning of 2020. And the students and researchers that are managing actually Radio Cavolo launched a call for producers, saying we are launching the radio, we are looking for people that want to have a show, and so to make the radio alive. And I got this email, it was a late afternoon, I think on a very wintry January day, and immediately I said, yes, I want to do something with you concerning storytelling and fairy tales. But it was really a very instinctive reply. And I sent this email out, and then I said, and now I waited, and because of course they would have gone through the different let's say proposals, and a few days after they said, yes, we do really like your proposal. We will be starting very soon, but then very soon the COVID pandemic also started. It was March 2020. In any case, the group of students and researchers of Radio Cavolo decided to go ahead, and it was a kind of challenge for all of us. So in that moment, my idea, was to have a kind of a radio sitting room, salotto, where I could virtually sit with storytellers and engage with them in conversation. And then, of course, listening to their stories, but COVID didn't allow for this. So I went live telling stories alone. So we could not access the radio studio, of course, so we were all pre-recording from home, doing some editing at home. So for me, also a big learning curve as well on how to use all the softwares related to audio. And so every day I was telling a story as a challenge. I think each of us towards during the COVID lockdown went through these personal challenges. So my challenge was to say a story every day to keep company. And so I was, of course, looking for fairy tales with this kind of message of optimism, of the possibility that doesn't matter what happens, we can always go out from tragic events. So this is the way Diffusione Fiaba started. And after the lockdown, I said, okay, it was an interesting experience to learn, to tell, and to be in touch with the audience with with stories that I was telling on my own. But I really want to have these a radio patch, because for me it has become a kind of orto radiophonic, so a radiophonic vegetable garden, if I translate literally from Italian to English. And so I started connecting with storytellers that I knew, like some of the storytellers I had studied in Brussels with. And then little by little, I start connected with the other storytellers I have never met before, because it's like word of mouth. I talked to one who said, you know, there is another one who could be interesting or interest. And so it has become a kind of, yes, a network of storytellers. So far, last week we celebrated the fourth anniversary. It's the fifth season of Diffusione Fiaba. And I have lost the count of how many storytellers came. Simone, of course, I also acknowledge that you were one of them last year in January 23, together with David Heathfield. A very honor and pleasure to have both of you in the patch. And then we organized a few other things together, but maybe we can go later on that. So the takeaway, for me, it has been an incredible experience, of course, to be exposed to so many storytellers coming from different parts of the world, each of them with its own storytelling style. But the common element that I always found is the generosity of sharing, the generosity of giving to the other ones these stories as a precious gift. And so as I was saying at the very beginning of the conversation, I've learned a lot through the storytellers I met virtually on the radio and their stories, fairy tales. And then I think that doesn't matter whether storytellers lives or works, that there is this very important needs for continuing telling stories, because there is the awareness of the positive impact of storytelling on the audience. And third, a little bit of the kind of negative side is that still storytellers and storytelling needs a better acknowledgement and recognition. So there are countries where storytellers do have a kind of federation. They are protected in case of unemployment. But other countries, and they are, I think, most of them, where the storytellers and the storytelling are not recognized. Storytelling is not recognized as a form of art. So it's a lot of fatigue, and sometimes it's difficult as well to live only out of telling stories. You were telling about the Sicilian tradition before, Simona. That's true. I mean, in Sicily, there has been a very strong tradition of storytellers, but unfortunately, it's fading out even here. Like now, a few weeks ago, I had the pleasure to interview one of the current storytellers here in Sicily. Today I'm sitting in Catania, not in Florence. I'm on holiday, so it's like 15 kilometers from where I live. Is a village called Paternò. And Paternò was the place where one of the most important storytellers was born. And his name is Ciccio Busacca. And Ciccio Busacca basically was so powerful, and of course the timing allowed for him to become famous. So he could live only telling stories. And then for personal reason, he had to move to Milano, and he started working with the very famous actor, Nobel Prize for Literature, Dario Fo, and his wife, Franca Rame. So this is just to say that in certain time it has been possible for storytellers to live only out of telling stories, and to keep this profession alive, and to meet people, and also to, in a way, educate people, or to teach or yes, to transfer knowledge through storytelling. But yes, the common element that nowadays there is this a little bit decreasing curve of interest, and also conducive environment. Yes, but I mean, I want always to conclude with a positive note for sure. Diffusione Fiaba, in a way, has met my dream to have this salotto, this dining room where storytellers can come. It continue. I mean, the interviews are made available on a free podcast, and it has turned sometimes also useful, for example, for researchers that are working on storytelling. And finally, I also try to invite, whenever possible, also scholars, so fabulists, so expert that studies and research on fairy tales and storytelling, because I also like to combine the scientific element to better understand what stories are, where fairy tales have come from, and how they have developed from different point of view.
Awesome. I love the
Oh,
idea
yes.
of the dining room table and people bringing gifts, and it's the stories. I love that.
Yeah, thanks.
And you were talking about also the generosity,
Mm,
sharing, and the fact that like the big aim is to share storytelling, and so that many people, as many people as we can reach, will get to know stories and storytelling. And I think that's something that Diffusione Fiaba and A Cornucopia of Tales and Tellers have in common.
yeah.
That's, I think, what Alan and I had in mind when we started the podcast. We said, all right, we want to have fun with stories, but our main aim was we want to spread storytelling as much as we can.
Mm,
And I could see myself a lot in when you were speaking about Diffusione Fiaba, the fact that we invite people to talk about storytelling, or when we tell stories, but then we get reactions from the people who listen to the stories. It's a wonderful experience, and I really appreciate listening to Diffusione Fiaba whenever I can.
Grazie. And for me, the same with the cornucopia of tales. And something that you asked me, Simona, and I would like to reply now. It's about the radio as a tool, as a means.
Yeah.
I'm, how do you say this? Radio lover or radio fanatic? Basically, I live listening radio. Doesn't matter what I do. For me, the radio has always been my one of the most important companions, let's say, more than television. And I think that the radio has this very powerful element of it's like a story. I mean, because the fact that you have to concentrate with your ears, again, it detonates different effect on our brains, and so allows for the listeners to continue this journey that starts somewhere in a radio studio with specific radio speakers or journalists. And so I thought that it's a good match, right, in between storytelling and a radio, because indeed you don't need to see forcibly the storyteller. Of course, it's always beautiful to see storytellers in presence on a stage, in a theater, but the radio very well serves the purpose, I think, of storytelling. And then it's nice to be, of course, part of a group, even if the other radio producer of Radio Cavolo are, of course, taking care of different shows, especially shows related to music. And lastly, this year is the 100th year since the invention of the radio. So again, I think it's important to recall how powerful this radio has been in the last since the creation, so 100 years ago, in different domains. So yeah, I think it's a good two means for me. I mean, I feel that there is a good match in between the radio and myself and the storytelling. As I was saying before.
It's the very personal approach, I think, when it's radio as opposed to TV, especially because I mean, people talk about it with podcasts as well, because you're listening and you're sort of privately listening to a voice.
Yeah.
I think it's worth saying as well, the invention of the radio by Italians in the very north of Ireland, in Ballycastle. It was an Italian inventor sent the messages from Rathlin Island Lighthouse to Ballycastle and back, and that was the invention of radio. Yeah.
Yeah,
Everything flies back to Italy and Ireland. There you go.
yeah. You're mentioning Guglielmo Marconi, of course. The inventor should have told his name before. Exactly. Yes, Guglielmo Marconi. Yeah.
Done in Ireland. I didn't know
Yep.
that.
Ballycastle,
There's
County
a
Antrim. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. There's a plague also. I don't know. Well, in Liguria, there's in Rapallo. That's a town in Liguria. If you walk up the mountains there, there's a santuario, kind of church, and behind there's a small mount, and there's a plaque saying here Guglielmo Marconi did some experiments when he was inventing radio. So I didn't know it was in Ireland, but
Yeah.
well, of course, I think he did experiments here and there to
He needed a
when
bit
he
of
was
whiskey
inventing
just
the
to get the
radio.
extra energy to go for it. Yeah. It was
Yeah, and also
Rathlin Island on the very north coast sent it back to the nearest town, Ballycastle. It's about 6 miles.
and probably Alan, he need to check if it worked with rain.
Yeah,
True. Yeah, it's a
indeed.
good point. Yeah. No interruption from the fairies either. Yeah.
Right. And Elena, I think Alan and I would like you to tell a story. But before you tell a story, I really want to know about one last thing from you. So I'll give you just 2 words, and you can elaborate on that how much you want. Feast mentorship. What can
Okay.
you tell us about that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Simona, because the FEAST mentorship has been a very, very important and pleasant activity that I did last year in 2023. So FEAST stands for the Federation of Asian Storytellers. And it's based in Singapore. And every year they do launch this call for interest people to do a mentorship with the federation, or better, with a group of storytellers that do belong to the federation. So last year I signed up, and because I wanted to work on a story that I really love, and it has been with me for many, many years. It's a Sicilian story, and I wanted to test in an environment, a cultural environment different from Italy or from Europe, because it's a story about a very special form of love, and there is sensuality in it. The story comes from Sicily, and I read it from the collection of Giuseppe Pitre, which was the first ethnograph in Sicily that went around, or the second one, but surely the first famous one that make in huge work of collection of Sicilian fairy tales, more than 400. So it's kind of an encyclopedia, and he went through different village, meeting people to people. So he collected these stories. The title is the sister of the count's sister, and it's for me it's a very beautiful love story where the woman is at the center of it, and he brings a message, if you want, of independence, autonomy of a woman in Sicily vis-a-vis the relationship with a man, who is of course the prince or the little king of the kingdom. And so I wanted to test it, as I was saying, in a different cultural environment. And so we trained online, of course, virtually, because my mentor is a storyteller whose name is Kiran Shah, and she lives in Australia, sometimes in Singapore. So we had to manage, as you can imagine, the difference of time, but we did manage. So we met once per month over 6 months, and Kira helped me a lot, of course, through re-elaborating these Sicilian stories. And finally, we performed it last November in a virtual, let's say, performance. So Kiran, as I said, was my mentor, but at the same time, we were a group of 5 women mainly from Asian Pacific, I would say, one from Argentina. And it was an incredible journey together and we learned a lot, of course, from the mentor. Each of us had a mentor, but also from the group, because again, the peer learning is always very stimulating. So if some of the audience is interesting, I would highly recommend to sign up for FIST mentorship. It's also a way to go out to the comfort zone and to be exposed to a group of peers and mentors that do come from a different cultural environment than we are. And again, Kiran Shah, I can only thank her because she led me through generosity again, and surely empathy and interest.
It's great. Thank you very much, Elena. Was very interested in discovering more about it. I'd never spoken to you about it, so I took this opportunity to learn myself about the mentorship. Thank you, Elena.
Thanks to both of you.
Now, have you got a story to tell us?
Yes, sure. I got a story to tell you. And I decided to choose the one I'm telling because of the first group of questions that you made at the beginning of the conversation. The question were, why did you start exploring the fantastic world of storytelling and fairy tales, and how and why are you still there? So the story for me explains a little bit why storytelling and stories are important for all the human beings. And the story was given to me by a French, not given to me, well, I took as a personal gift, but actually is a story that a French storyteller was telling to many people sitting in a room, so a good bunch of people in front of her. And I took it as a personal gift. And then I have been finding these stories again and again in different fairy tales collections. So I said, wow, so it means that, I mean, it's a sign. So the story is a traditional story coming from the Swahili culture. So it can be many countries in the eastern part of Africa. And the title is The Meat of the Tongue. And it goes like this. There is a kingdom very, very far away from we are sitting, the three of us today. And in this kingdom, there is a very wealthy and rich king. He lives in a beautiful castle. You can imagine it's made of stones and is protected by very thick and tall walls. In between the walls and the palace, there is a garden which is always very green and full of fruit and flowers. And the king lives exactly in that castle together with his wife, the queen, who is always very sad and thin and pale. So the king is very preoccupied. As you can imagine, as every king, he has to spend most of his day working, receiving the authorities of his countries, the community leaders. He has to solve problems. At the same time, he needs to meet and discuss with the ambassadors coming from different countries in the world, and as well as with traders to understand what the kingdom needs in trade in terms of food, goods, and other items. But every day, at the end of the day, the king stops at his desk and thinks, what can I do more of what I have already done? I cannot live like this. My wife is always so pale and sad, and she's becoming thinner and thinner day by day. I've tried everything, the best doctors, the best magician, and they have all come from different parts of the countries and also from abroad. I don't know, I start being hopeless. And this would have happened basically every day. One day, though, he's again sitting at his desk, reading some paper, writing out the documents, and over a sudden, the king stands up and starts walking up and down his office, and again thinking about his wife. And then he gets close to one of the windows of his office and looks outside down the beautiful garden that, as I said before, is always full of flowers and fruit. And then in that precise moment, he sees a beautiful, young, smiley and rosy young woman entering the main gate of the walls and walking through the garden, and then stopping in front of the gardener. The young woman was carrying a basket full of food, and so as soon as she sees the gardener, she gives the basket to him. They look into each other's eyes and they exchange few words, and then she leaves. She goes back to the gate, and then she walks outside the king's palace walls. At that point, the kings go very quickly through the office, then past the doors, and then goes down the stairs of the palace as quick as possible. He goes into the gardener, looking for the gardener, said, here you are. Now, you have to tell me. Sorry, sir, but that was my wife. She just come for a few seconds. Stop. I just want to know what is the secret. How is that possible that your wife is so beautiful, rosy, and smiley? I have to know. And so the gardener looks at the king and says, my lord, it's the meat of the tongue. The meat of the tongue? Only this? Yes, sir. And so the king again very quickly goes back to the palace and runs down the stairs until he reaches the kitchen. And there he stops in front of the chef and says, Chef, That's a very important order for you. You have to look for all the animals we have in the kingdom and then prepare as many as dishes you can with their tongues. And this has to be done by tomorrow lunchtime. Yes, sirs. Your order is my pleasure. And so the following day, at lunchtime, the king goes into the dining room and he sees this huge table full of dishes, and he can smell the spices and the different tastes, and he starts smiling. And so he goes out of the dining room, he crosses the long corridors until he reaches the room of his wife, the queen. He opens the door and says, "My dear, my lovely, I have a surprise for you today. Please, come, follow me." And so the king and the queen goes through the long corridor until they reach the dining room. But when the queen enters, say, "Oh my God, so disgusting." So she immediately goes back to her room. And you can imagine the king is again desperate and starts going around this table full of dish, and then again he decides to go back running down the stairs until he reaches the garden, and he looks for the gardener, and then you told me that the secret was the meat of the tongue, but this has not worked with my wife. Now we will do the following. You will go back home with my wife, the queen, and your wife will be coming living here in the palace with me for 6 months. But my lord, we live in a very simple hut at the end of the town, close to the forest. I don't care. This is what we will be doing for the next 6 months. And so days after days, weeks after weeks, months after months, and then after the 6 months passes, the queen goes back to the palace, and she's now smiling, rosy, as beautiful as she has never been. And she's accompanied by the gardener. So they go through the gardener, they climb the stairs, they enter the office of the king, who is sitting there, as always, at his desk. And when he lifts his eyes and sees his wife, he cannot believe. So he stands up and goes towards her. And at the same time, the gardener looks in the room because he cannot see his wife. And sadly, the gardener sees that the wife is sitting in a corner, and she is thin, sad, and pale. And then the king says, "But now someone should explain to me what happened. How come my wife is beautiful again and the gardener's wife is not anymore?" And at that exact point, the wife's gardener stands up and walks in the middle of the room, and she says, "My lord, you know, every day, it doesn't matter what has happened, my husband goes back home. He comes back to me, and there I have prepared a ready dinner for him. And we sit down together, and we'll start telling me stories. And then when he has finished the stories, he starts singing for me and playing the lute for me. And this is the way we spend all the nights until we fall asleep together." And it's only at that moment that the king understands what the meat of the tongue is.
I love that. That's fantastic. The myth of the tongue, and because
Brilliant.
you're trying to work it out for a long time, and then it becomes so obvious. I love that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, those are also the kind of stories that I like. That so the conclusion is not that evident. You cannot guess it at the at the beginning. Thank you very much for listening.
Love it. Love it. Thank you very much for telling it and sharing it. That's really nice.
Brilliant. And thank you very much, Elena, for speaking with us. It was brilliant to have you here. We've been talking about doing this episode for I don't know how many months, and now finally we got down to doing it. I'm so happy that we had the time to sit down virtually and speak about stories, storytelling, and listening to you tell us a story. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you to you, Simona and Alan. It was a great pleasure to exchange with you, and in a way to find that we do have many elements in common, especially the willingness to let people know how beautiful and important storytelling is. So thank you very much for this opportunity today.
Thank you. It's been really good fun the Thursday morning. Thank you very much. Cornucopia of Tales and Tellers is a passion project brought to you by English teachers Alan and Simona, who want to create a compilation, or a cornucopia, if you will, of stories from all around the world by as many tellers around the world as possible. So grab a cup of tea, chai, water, or uskabraha, relax and enjoy hearing the tales that have been handed down for generations, or even ones that were dreamt up just yesterday. Music by Purple Planet. You can find us on Facebook at A Cornucopia of Tales and Tellers. And if you like what you hear, you can buy us a coffee to help fund future episodes and the hosting of our podcast. Link in the description.